What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, I'd like to go over one of my favorite topics when it comes to the DOM. This is going to be DOM manipulation. We need the ability to be able to create elements, insert them into the DOM, update them, as well as delete them. Up until now, what we've been seeing are things like inner HTML and text content. Inner HTML allowed us to actually create these elements in the DOM using a string. I mentioned that this is something that generally we don't really want to do. There's a lot of security considerations. It's just also really messy and confusing, and there's some limitations as well. What we're going to see in this video is the correct DOM API versions of doing all of these things, as well as much more. And it's going to set us up really nicely for future videos and when we get to things like web components as well. So we want to be able to create elements as well as do all the things that elements natively have available to them, things like attributes and event listeners when we get to those, and a whole bunch of other things. And this is all available through us, through this DOM API for creating these different nodes. Let's just get right to it to see what I mean. Okay, so to start, as I mentioned and I hinted at earlier, DOM manipulation is really about kind of these operations as well as a couple others, but mainly these. We want to be able to create our own elements. Okay, so like paragraph tags, div tags, all that kind of stuff. We want to be able to create them on the fly without using inner HTML. We would then want to be able to take those elements that we create and actually insert them into the DOM so they actually get rendered on the screen along with the rest of our content. We also want to be able to update those elements. So things like the attributes, the classes, the styling. We want to add event listeners, remove event listeners. All this kind of stuff is really important for us to be able to do with these elements so that they are no different from all the elements that we add in things like HTML. We also want to be able to delete these elements or remove them from the DOM as we need them, or when we're done with them, we're transitioning between different parts of this tree. So let's take a look at what this actually means when it comes to the creation method. So I have on the screen here a bunch of node creation methods. So I chose that word on purpose here, so we'll see what I mean in a second. The first one I want to show you is this one. This is the one we're going to be using the most. This is document.createElement. We pass it as an argument a tag name. So something like p tag or a span tag or a div tag, etc. When we give that tag to this createElement method, it's going to return to us an HTML element of that type. So for example, if we give it createElement of type P, it would give us back a paragraph tag that would actually have all of the object properties that we would expect for a paragraph tag or paragraph element in the DOM. We're going to see what this looks like shortly. We're actually going to get quite an amount of practice with this, both through this video and the exercise video following this. Now, there are other types of nodes, right? This is why it's so important for us to understand the different node types in the DOM, right? That's why there was an entire video on this previously where we saw things like the text nodes, the comment nodes, document fragments, the doc type nodes, all that kind of stuff, right? There are more things in the DOM than meets the eye, and they're not all elements. So for example, the create text node method on the document object is going to give us the ability to create a text node, right? As the name implies. This is different from an element node. It's not the same thing. It has totally different properties, totally different methods than a regular element node. In fact, even the element nodes, right? Things like a paragraph tag has different methods than like an input tag, right? So of course, a text node is going to be quite different as well because it's not going to have a lot of that functionality. As you can imagine, the same is true for comments. We can create comments on the fly, right? Because that's part of the DOM. So we can use document.createComment, give it the comment text that we want, and we'll actually get back a comment node that we can then insert into the DOM. We'll look at how the actual insertion methods work shortly. One that's really awesome and definitely less obvious and probably seen in the wild is this one called document.createDocumentFragment. This is a document fragment node. We're actually going to use this a little bit later on, but I just wanted to put this here for sake of completion, but also so that we kind of jog our memory in the future when we actually come back to this. If you've used technologies like React before, you've probably seen like the React fragment, which allows us to actually create kind of a holder, like a div, like an invisible div of sorts for other elements, but then that disappears once we actually put it into the DOM or once we render that component. This is exactly how it works behind the scenes. This document fragment is exactly where that comes from. This is effectively a holder for other elements where we don't actually want to use something like a div or a section tag or whatever it happens to be, because we don't want that node to actually show up when we put it into the DOM. We can actually just use this as a holder, and then all the elements get flattened out once we actually enter it into the DOM later. If that seems confusing for now, don't worry about it. We'll come back to this later, and a practical example will make it make much more sense going forward once we take a look at it. So before we kind of get to these, and I'm going to pull up an example as I mentioned shortly, I just want to show you what is happening here in practice, okay? Because this is so important, and visually it's important to actually see what's happening, very similar to how we looked at how arrays work in JavaScript in general. So what I have here on the left-hand side is kind of a chronological series of steps that we might do when we try to create an element, for example, okay? So in this case, a paragraph element. On the right, what I have is the computer's memory. So this is actually the RAM, or the actual working memory of the computer. Now, the most important reason I'm showing you this for, and kind of the most important consideration to take away from this, is that the things here on the right in this memory, in the RAM, are not yet in the DOM. Okay? These are just temporary kind of constructs that we can manipulate, change, and work with before we even put them in the DOM. Okay, so it's kind of like this separate space that is not being rendered in the browser yet. So we can do whatever we want in here before we put it into the actual DOM, which is pretty remarkable. So for example, if I did this line of code right here to start, which is assigning to the variable p, which is a const, the result of document.createElement and the p for the argument to create element, we will get back a p tag. Technically, we get back a p DOM object, which we can think of as a p tag. So really, we kind of get something like this, but it has all the object properties inside of it because it's an object. But we really get back an empty p tag effectively from this function call right here. Okay, but this p tag is not in the DOM yet. We will not see it show up in the Elements tab of our DevTools. Okay, so what's really cool though is that we can actually start manipulating this as if it was in the DOM, right? So we can access all the properties on it, such as text content, and start adding text into it. So I can say p.textContent, add like, hello there, and then we would imagine that this is what it would look like when we where to put it in the DOM later. But again, this is not in the DOM yet. This is just temporary in memory. So this is kind of what it would look like in memory. We can also do other things like set attributes, in this case, set the ID to be amazing, and we would get something like this. And again, not in the DOM yet. I keep emphasizing that because it's so important and really helps us understand and work with these methods going forward. Later on, when we start looking at things like event listeners, we can also attach these event listeners during these series of steps before we even get to putting something in the DOM, which is totally awesome. Right? It just kind of boggles the mind how much stuff you can do here before you even put this element or set of elements into the DOM. Okay, so let's actually code this out together and take a look at what this actually looks like. So I'm going to pull up VS Code. I'm going to put a new file in here. I'm just going to call this, let's just say, createElement.html. Okay, so to start in here, I'm going to do my doc type. And this is going to be HTML. Then I'm going to create my HTML tag. In here, I'm going to have my head, I'm going to have my title. I'll just say this is create element demo. Dino demo. I'd love to teach us Dino actually at some point shortly. It's another technology very similar to Node.js. And then we have our body. And then in our body, what I'll do is I'll just create an empty div tag, and I'll just save all this just so that we can see kind of what this looks like. Okay, so nothing too kind of fancy here, right? This is a pretty boring web page. So I'm just gonna right click on this, reveal it in my Finder, or find it wherever it was in your actual computer file system. Double click on it so that it opens up in our browser. And then what we should see is, in this case at least, a blank page. I'm just gonna super zoom in here just so that we can see stuff happen when I actually do this. But what we'll see here, and I'm going to have to zoom in on this part here as well, if I open up my head and then I open up my body over here, we can see what we'd expect, right? We have the body, an empty div, we have our title, which is showing up here, create element demo. If I go to the console tab, we can actually start writing some code. Now, let's see what happens if we try to create an element. And this is why that previous slide that I was showing you is so important. If I say const p is equal to document dot, I'm going to zoom in a tiny bit more on this, create element, and I'm going to create a p tag. Okay. And I look at this p, what we'll see is I get back this empty p tag, right? As we kind of would expect. But check this out, right? If I switch back to the elements tab, there is no p tag in the DOM yet, right? This has not been inserted into the DOM yet. Okay, this just exists in memory. And if we don't want to, we can just never insert into the DOM for whatever reason, right? In this case, this is just a regular old JavaScript object that in theory, if we wanted to, we could put into the DOM. But right now, it's just a JavaScript object. All right, so to prove that to you, I'm going to say console, I'm just going to clear out my console here, console.dir, I'm going to console.dir.p, and if I open it, what we'll see is all of those object properties inside of this p tag, right? So we can see a whole bunch of stuff in here, all the different events, and then a bunch of other stuff like the style tags and the text content and all that kind of fun stuff, okay? So that is just a regular JavaScript object right now that we can do stuff with if we want. So for example, if I actually open this up right now and I show you the text content, A, B, C, D, actually you can even see things here, like there's no children in here, there's no child nodes in here. Okay, the class list, there's no classes in here right now, there's no dataset attributes, there's no ID, right? And element O, P, Q, R, S, T, where's T? There's text content is empty, right? But tag name is a p tag. Okay, so there's nothing in here yet that that has any text, even though it is a p tag. So it's an empty p tag. So I can say p.textContent is equal to hello there, for example, right? Now, if I look at the p tag now, what we'll see is that there is hello there in there, just as we would expect to see inside of a p tag. But again, if I switch back to my elements tab, and I know I'm hammering this, but it's so important, it is not in here yet, okay? We are just manipulating properties on this object inside of our memory. Our computer's memory, I should say. Okay, now just for fun, just to match the slides here, I'll just p.set attribute. I'll set the ID attribute. I'll just say like cool, just like that. Why not? Right, and then if I look at the p tag, we can see that it has an ID of cool. Right. So again, just treat it as a regular JavaScript object, and that's how it would work until we actually decide to do something with it. Like in this case, we're going to insert it into the DOM. So up until now, with what I showed you on the slides and some of the previous videos that we looked at, this is kind of what we have available to us. So now the question is, great, we have this p tag available to us, and we have this DOM that we've created that's empty. Let's say we want to put the p tag in the div tag, or maybe before the div tag or after the div tag, right? How do we do that, right? And what's going to happen, and is it going to work, right? So let's take a look at what that looks like. Now, this slide is a little bit busy, so I apologize for that, but hopefully if you kind of look at this for a while and I walk through it, it'll make some sense. So over here on the left-hand side, I have some HTML. Okay, I've super spread it out just so that it's a bit more clear. Hopefully that doesn't get too distracting. So we have a head, we have our title, in this case a demo, we have our body, and then in the body we have a div tag. Now I've color coded this div tag to match this div tag right here, which we're grabbing using query selector on the right-hand side. Okay, so if I do query selector for a div, I would get back this div tag. So just to show you what I mean, if I did query selector here, so I say const div is equal to document.createSelector, and I grab the div tag. Since there's only one div tag on this document, and I look at that div, we will see that I get back this div right here. And since it doesn't have any height or width, you can see that it's not really highlighting anything in the DOM, but you can see this little kind of a bubble that's popping up in the top left of my screen, right? And I can actually access that div tag, which is the one that is inside the body in this case. So if I come back here, That's effectively what we're doing here. In this case, I'm creating an h1 tag, right? We can create any tag that we want that exists in HTML. We can even create our own custom tags once we get to web components. And then I'm setting the text content to be blog, in this case, of an h1 tag. This h1 tag has not, at this point, before this dotted line here, been inserted into the DOM yet. Again, just in the memory of the computer. But check this out. If we want to actually manifest this into the actual DOM and actually have it rendered and show it up into the real DOM that the user is seeing, we can use these DOM manipulation syntax. There are 4 main ones, and I'm going to go through a couple others later that we'll sometimes run into, but these are the main ones. There's before, prepend, append, and after. Okay, so hopefully this drawing helps you understand kind of what these are, because when you first see these words, they seem kind of confusing, but let's kind of walk through these one at a time and then practice this together as well. So if I say div, which is this orange box right here, right? This is the section for the div. And I ask JavaScript or the DOM API to put this h1 before the div. That's basically how you would read this, right? As you would imagine, that would show up before the div, right? Like a sibling before the div. So on the same level as the div, but before the div tag, not nested in the div tag, not like after the div tag, right? Before the div tag at the same level. And I'm going to skip down to after just so it makes more sense down here in the pink. After is going to do the opposite, right? As you might imagine. After is going to say, hey, insert this h1 after the div tag, but at the same level. So we would get this blog h1 showing up right here in the pink, but after the div tag. Okay, hopefully those make sense. That kind of just in English seems to kind of follow pretty well. Now these two are a little bit more confusing, and you might have actually seen these before. At least append is the most common one. So prepend, which is this yellow one right here, is saying inside of the div, put the h1 as the first child. Okay, so basically what that's doing in this case is putting it right below the div tag, but nested inside as a child of the div. Okay, so this is putting the h1 as the first element child, in this case, of the div. Okay. Append is doing the opposite, as you might imagine. It's putting it as the last child of this div in this case. Now, the div is just an element, right? I could have chosen any other element, like an article tag or a section tag or something, and then append and prepend on that. It's just this thing on the left is where we are putting it relative to, and then these words are kind of where relative to element are we actually inserting this element right here. Okay, so again, prepend is the first child, append is the last child, before is before the element as a sibling, directly before, after is directly after the element, but not as a child, in this case, like as a sibling. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's actually flip back to Chrome in this case and take a look at what this actually looks like. So if I come back to Chrome, and I take a look at that p tag. So remember I had p, that looks like this. What's gonna happen if I do this? Let's check it out. I'm gonna say div dot, and I'll start with before, because that's kind of, if we come back to this document here, let's just kind of go in almost order here, before, after, prepend, append, just so it's a bit more clear. So I'm gonna say dot before. And what do I want to put before? Before actually can take many nodes, but in this case, we just have one that we want to add. So I'm going to say, put the way to read this is put the p tag before the div tag. Okay, so I press enter here. I'd like you to watch what happens here inside my actual browser as I execute this line of code. Okay, ready? 1, 2, and 3. And there we go, right? We get this hello there showing up because that was the content of this hello there p tag. And notice now when I hover over this, it actually highlights in the actual DOM itself because we've inserted this into the DOM. So to prove that to you, I'm going to come back to my Elements tab and check this out, right? We have put the p tag before the div tag. Now, I know this is probably like, oh my gosh, Nader, I get it. Like, please go faster, right? But it's important to really appreciate what's happening and to go slow with this, because we're going to be using these different DOM methods to do all sorts of crazy things with these APIs. And we're even going to be able to nest elements inside of each other as we get through these methods. So super important to go slow and appreciate what's happening here. So we got the div tag, we put the p tag before the div tag. Okay. Now I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to do this kind of the other. I'm going to say div dot after, and I'm going to put that p tag that I have after the div. Okay. I'm going to press enter. Now visually, there's no change over here in the DOM. Okay. Because the div tag was already empty in this case. But if we look at the actual DOM itself, notice that that p tag has now shifted, right? And it's because we're using the same p tag reference. We didn't create a copy of the p tag or a second p tag. I'm taking that same element, right? And I'm moving it around depending on these methods. So now it's after the div, but as a sibling. Okay, cool. So that's very apt based on the ID of the p tag. Now check this out. If I do this, if I say div dot, so we looked at before, we just looked at after. So just to come back here, we want to look at prepend and append, right? So these are now going to nest the element inside of the div in this case, which is the thing on the left-hand side. So I'm going to say dot prepend. I'm going to put the p in here. Now, again, we're not going to visually see a difference in the actual UI because the div is already empty, but we would see visual differences depending on if we had many other things on the screen, and we'll see more examples of this as we actually get to the exercises. I'm going to execute that. I'm going to come back to my Elements tab, and now notice the div tag has an arrow beside it and the p tag has disappeared from the body because the div tag is now inside this div tag. Okay, so if I switch back to the console and I do div.append, we'll actually not see a difference because the actual div tag doesn't have any children inside of it. So let me come back to VS Code really quick and put something in here just so we can see that difference. So in this div tag, I'm going to put, for example, let's put an h1 tag. And then here, I'm going to just put hello. Okay, switch back to my browser. I'm going to refresh the page. And if we were to do these now again, and I'll do this really quick just to really show you this now that we've seen it in the DOM, the UI differences as well. If I say, let's clear this out. Now I've actually lost my div because I've refreshed the page, right? So I'm going to say const div equals document.createSelector. I'm going to grab the div here, and I'm going to say const p is equal document.createElement p.text content is equal to, monkeys. Oh, I have to put this in. Monkeys are the best, right? I should put an emoji in there. And now what I can do is I can say before, after, and prepend and append, and we can actually see some of these visual changes. So let's just go through that again, just to really, really verify that we understand what's happening. So I'm going to say div dot before. I'm going to put the p before. Let's visually look at what's happening. I'd like you to predict, what are we going to see? Again, p, right? So just to really clarify what's in here, this is div, and this is p in this case, not page offset, just p. Just p. Do I not have p? There we go. There's p right there. P, right? Inside div is hello. Okay. And p hasn't been inserted yet. Right? So if I run div.before p, 1, 2, 3, try to guess what's going to happen. There we go, right? It's going to show up in the DOM visually as well, and shift that down because now this is showing up before. If I change this to after, div.after, I'm going to put the p in there, and now it's shifted to after. If we switch it to the DOM, we can see that now it's showing up as a sibling of the div, right? But after, now prepend and append are going to be a bit more obvious as well. Say div.prepend. I'm going to put the p, and this is going to show up before as well, very similar to the previous example, but now it's nested inside the div as a child, right? Inside the div, right before the h1. And if I do div.append, this is going to be as a child of the div but after the h1 in this case. So if I switch back to elements tab, you can see that the p tag here is now after, but nested as a child. So if I collapse this all, everything is inside that div tag. Pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. So we can do a lot of really cool things with this. We can, again, as I mentioned, set event listeners, attributes, styling, all sorts of DOM APIs available to us with these methods. And this is much, much more clear than using things like inner HTML, because now we can start manipulating these one at a time, treat them as regular objects, add them, remove them, manipulate them one at a time, just as we would in regular JavaScript. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, we can also remove these DOM nodes. Okay, and in this case, all you need is a handle to the node. So in this case, for example, if I grab div like I had before and I call remove on it, which is a method on any element, I can actually remove the element from the DOM completely right away. So let's try this out by example. So I'm actually going to see if I can remove this h1 tag. Okay, so I'm going to say over here, I'm going to clear this console. I'm going to say const h1 is equal to document.createSelector, the h1, right? And if I look at the h1, what I'll see is I have that h1 tag. If I hover over it, that's this one right here. Now take a look at the DOM. If I do h1.remove, which is a method, I'm going to count to 3, 1, 2, and 3, and there we go. It's gone, right? If I switch to the Elements tab, it is completely deleted from the actual DOM itself. It is no longer there. Okay, so be careful with this, right? Because as you can imagine, if I were to remove a parent node, like the body, everything inside there, all the children would also get deleted as well. So just keep that in mind. We're actually deleting that kind of root of that subtree. Okay, now I do also kind of want to mention a couple of things really quick. I skipped over them a little bit. So over here, I showed that we can create text nodes and comment nodes. I want to show you this before I switch to these other methods. So if I come back to Chrome, I can say, for example, let me just clear my console here. I'll say const text equals document.createTextNode. And I'm going to say hello from a text node. And I'll just leave it at that. And now if I look at my text node, what you'll see is that this is purely a text, like just text. There's no elements tag around it, right? And if I say text.node type, you can see it's node type of 3, which is a text node, which we saw in the node type video. Now, if I do this, for example, so if I say p, which is this paragraph right here, right? And I say dot, and now I can put this inside, I can put this alongside, I can do all sorts of stuff depending on which method I use. But for example, let's just say I say p.after, right? And I put this text. Try to think of what's going to happen. Are we going to see any visual changes in the DOM? What are we going to see when we actually switch over to the Elements tab? Okay, 1, 2, and 3. There we go. Hello from a text node, right? And I switch to the Elements tab, and there it is, right? This is just a text node directly inserted as a sibling after the p tag. Okay, that hopefully makes sense, right? In this case, if we were to shift this around, it would work the exact same way as before because those methods work with nodes as well as actual HTML elements. Now, let's take a look at a comment as well. So I'll say const comment is equal to document.createComment, not cdata section. That's not what I want. I want to create a comment, and I'm going to say hello from a comment. I'll just put that in all caps for some reason because why not? And I look at this comment, and you can see that this API actually inserts the correct kind of tags for us for that comment. So that's pretty cool, right? I'd like you to think what's going to happen if I was to say put this before the p tag, right? So if I did p.before I put the comment, are we going to see any visual changes? And what are we going to see when I actually switch to the DOM? All right, 1, 2, and 3. All right, so no visual changes. Interesting. That kind of makes sense, right? That's how comments work. I'll switch to the Elements tab and check that out, right? It shows up right before this p tag, which is exactly what we told it to do, right? So you can hopefully imagine the power of this, right? We literally can access any element and start manipulating things, put them nested, unnested. We can have children of children, right? So just to kind of wrap this up before I show you the last thing, what I can actually do is I can, for example, create a const. I'll just say like an h2 is equal to document.createElement. I'll do an h2. So default to h1 there. I'll say h2.textContent is equal to, I'll just say this is an h2 tag. Okay, great. But check this out, right? This is still in the memory. I haven't actually put this in the DOM yet, right? This h2, like when I highlight over it, nothing is being added to the DOM yet. I can actually keep manipulating this. So I can say, for example, const, I don't know, I'll do maybe a button, right, is equal to document.createElement, and I'll just say button, right? And I'll say maybe button.textContent is equal to click me, right? Great, there we go. And now check this out, right? I have my h2, I have my button. I'm gonna put the button inside the h2, right? Do I want it before the text, after the text? I can choose, right? So for example, let's say I want it after the text. So I'm gonna say h2 dot append, and I'm gonna append the button to the h2, okay? Now I'm gonna clear my console just so that we can see what this looks like. And I'm gonna look at my h2 here, and look at that, right? I have my text node here in my h2 like we added, right? The text content, and then I have a button. But notice this is not in the DOM yet, right? This is not in the DOM yet. There's no h2 in here. There's no button in here yet, but we can add it, right? So let's say that I want to add it maybe right after this div, right? So I can say document.body, right? And I can put it right at the bottom of the body, or I can ask it to put it as a sibling of the div. Now we have all the power available to us to do all this kind of stuff. So I'll just do it inside the body as the last element. So one way to do that is document.body.append, and I'm going to append the h2. Now I'd like you to think, what are we going to see in the DOM when I actually do this? And I'll switch to the elements tab one more time. So 1, 2, and 3. And there we go, right? Check it out. It's actually in the DOM, and I can click on this button. It doesn't do anything because we don't have any event listeners yet, but it definitely is rendering correctly. And if I switch back to the elements tab, now we can see that this h2 is in here. Here's the actual element that we just looked at inside the console in the memory before we input it into DOM. Now we can move this around if we want, right? Super, super powerful. Totally awesome. Just for your own information as well, the entire power of HTML and CSS and even JavaScript are at our fingertips. So for example, if these had some styles added to them or classes added to them and we had CSS on the page, those would be applied correctly as we would expect. And similar to any kind of event listeners and other things that would traverse the DOM, they would take these into account as well, which is super, super powerful and amazing. We're going to get into that more as we explore this concept deeper, as well as we look at things, as I keep hinting at, like web components. Okay, so to wrap up this video, I just want to go through a couple of methods that I didn't explain in depth because we don't see them as often, but they're important to know, and I might include these in the exercises if we have a chance. Now, there's two big ones. There's one called replaceWith. This method allows us to have an element, for example, that div, and then we can call replaceWith on it, and we can give it another node, right? So we can replace it completely with another node. This is effectively the same thing and mainly a shortcut for removing something from the DOM and then adding it into the DOM as well in one step, right? So we're replacing one DOM node with another DOM node. cloneNode is, as you might expect, it can take a node and we can clone it and create a copy of it basically. Now, there are some caveats with this. Things like event listeners and all that kind of stuff, which again, we haven't got to yet, can cause issues and don't get copied. If you clone a node and it has an ID, you will have two IDs, so you have to change it. There's all sorts of things like that we have to keep in mind when we're using these functions, but they are available for us to kind of shorten some of the code that we would write if we want to create some of these. And it's a very deep tree, and we don't actually want to kind of nest all these create element calls. Okay. Now, to wrap up this video, I just want to mention these methods as well, and you've probably seen these before. These are older methods. I think all these are actually on the node interface instead of the element interface, but you've probably seen append child. Maybe you've seen insert before and remove child, and potentially even replace child. These kind of work as you might expect them to work, but I would advise you not to use them except in specific cases where they can do something slightly differently and you might need that for whatever reason. But generally speaking, everything here you can accomplish with the methods that I just showed you, which are the more modern API versions of the DOM. These are just kind of historical and they're previously, whereas this syntax over here has been created to kind of unify things and have it make more sense and be more consistent. So as you can see, these are a bit more confusing, a bit more scattered, and these are just there for legacy reasons to support older websites. Awesome. So I hope that was useful and interesting to you. It's super fun to create these elements and start inserting them into the DOM and moving them around up and down the DOM as well. We can do a lot of really awesome stuff with that. I can't wait to get to the exercises for this as well, where we're actually going to get practice with that, creating different types of components, actually being able to nest them into each other and adding attributes and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be a super fun time to actually get that working and actually see it showing up and rendering in the DOM. If you did like this video, I would love it as usual if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. But until that exercise video, I will see you later. Ciao.